Content analysis. If you know anything about this methodology, you probably think, what the heck? Look up some articles and measure the column inches, or count the number of times a phrase is said, right? That was my understanding of content analysis until I took an entire class on the subject at Colorado State. They're fun, incredibly informative, and a really cool method, but they also are very time consuming and detailed. Content analyses were created by communication scholars to identify, count, and analyze how often messages and message characteristics are embedded in the text under analysis. For example, I might want to compare how often the president uses negative language to describe the media, or I might want to compare the camera shots used to cover the women's U.S. national soccer team versus the men's U.S. national team. What's the difference between a survey and content analysis? Simple. In a survey, you are studying and measuring people and their attitudes, behavior, and knowledge, and with a content analysis, you are measuring text in 5 areas. And this is why you see lots of people gravitate to content analysis. You don't have to go through the IRB process. So the 5 textual areas we examine and describe content, we test hypotheses of message characteristics, we compare media content to the real world, we assess particular groups' images, and we establish a starting point to examine the effects of media. First, we describe communication content so we can identify what exists. Take, for example, this article examined anti-smoking advertisements. You may want to stop the video and take a look now. This is a good example of how we look at what does exist and how these messages are being used in the campaign against smoking. We also want to test hypotheses. I might have a hypothesis that more toy commercials are going to air from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. than at any other time during the day. Another example would be what you're seeing here. Males are more likely than women to be eating less health food in food advertisements. You then are going to examine a sample of magazine ads and determine is it a male or female in the ad? Is the individual eating healthy food or no? And when you're all finished, you'll know, yes, your hypothesis was correct, or no, it was not supported. One of the big things we do with content analysis is compare media content with the real world. This is what you see here. Number of Latinos on TV compared to the U.S. population, types of crimes depicted on TV compared to actual crimes committed. One I remember learning about in my content analysis class was how husbands are depicted in television sitcoms. Think Everybody Loves Raymond or King of Queens, and how the husband is depicted as a bumbling idiot who always says or does the wrong thing. Now I know from personal experience, this is, well, false. Okay, that was a joke. But you get the idea. Another use of content analysis is to assess the image of a particular group in a society. We may look at television programming to see what kinds of jobs different races are portrayed as having. Or we may read news articles about sexual orientation to examine the language used to see how alternate lifestyles are portrayed. We may be able to determine how teenagers are portrayed by looking at the advertising in teen magazines. Finally, we also turn to content analysis for a starting point for media effects research. For example, Gerdner's cultivation theory posits that people who watch more television are going to have a worldview that matches the images they see. For example, if you watch a lot of violent television, you are likely to view the world as a darker, more violent place. Where would Gerdner get the start for his study? By doing a content analysis to examine the kinds of shows people might watch. A content analysis is a system. The first time I saw this model, I thought, man, how does anybody complete a content analysis? And the fact is, this is a process, and not many people do it. Remember, before you come up with your research questions or hypotheses, you have to come up with the idea, develop your introduction, and then do your literature review. If you're using a pre-existing survey instrument already developed, you're ready to go if that is your method of choice. But there are no pre-existing coding sheets and code books for a content analysis. Each one is unique, and you don't have to do coder training for a survey. You do for a content analysis, and this can take 2, 3, or even 4 rounds. But I promise you, after you've gone through all this, the results are very, very worth it. First, as with any method, you need to determine your research questions and/or hypotheses. Again, this drives your study. In the case of a content analysis, they're going to help you determine what your sample of text is going to be and what kinds of data you are going to be looking for so you can include it in your coding sheet. And, of course, they're going to help you determine what kinds of statistical tests you're going to be able to run. Next, you need to determine the universe of text. Whereas in a survey we need to consider our population, or the people we want to respond to our survey, here we need to determine what text to use. If you're interested in men's magazine advertisements, for example, we need to determine what qualifies as a men's magazine. And with all research, the beauty of this is that you, as the researcher, get to operationalize the definition of men's magazine as it fits your study. This definition of the universe is determined by our research question or hypotheses, a specific time period, and availability. Take this example. We want to know how often presidents invoked God in public presentations between 1950 and 2000. We know from this that our universe of text is going to be presidential public presentations, so newspaper articles about presidents in the 1940s or public presentations by governors from 1950 to 2000 are not going to be considered. Also, we do not have access to the notes from presidents' cabinet meetings, so we're not going to have that information. Only public presentations by presidents from the years 1950 to 2000 are going to be considered. We also need to take a moment here to state again that you, as the researcher, are going to define invoked God. Is it a mere mention of God, as in, oh my God? Or is it going to be in some reverent context? Are we only talking about the God of Christianity, or are we considering any God of any religion? These are things that you, as the researcher, get to determine. The third step in the content analysis process is selecting the text. This is just as in a survey. You're not going to look at every magazine, every public presentation, every newspaper article, every film. You're going to pick a sample of those texts. As with a survey, think probability or mathematical properties. Consider the sample size, which is the same as in a survey, so use the sheet. And consider your sampling frame and do a simple random sample. In content analysis, we like to use stratification. Think about using week, month, and year. We may collect what is called a composite or constructed week, month, or year. This is done for one simple reason. We tend to see different television programming in the summer versus the fall. We have different newspaper coverage in an election year than in a non-election year. We see different commercials at different times of day. So, as you're doing your sampling, you might take the first Monday, the second Tuesday, the third Wednesday, and so on in each month and construct a year, or 365 units of analysis of a specific newspaper. Then you get a really nice cross-section of the type of coverage and a good sampling of what the coverage might be throughout a calendar year, and it's not skewed because it's looking at one specific time during the year that might be very different from other times. This is just a reminder of the differences between non-probability and probability sampling and why you would choose each. We talked about this during the discussion of surveys, so I'm not going to go into depth with it here. Just remember this is a thing, and you need to consider your study and which approach you want to take. You've heard me mention a couple times now the term unit of analysis. You're probably wondering what that is. Simple. It's the smallest unit to be measured. If you're interested in how women are portrayed in car magazine ads, the unit of analysis is not the magazine, but advertisements. It would not be anything more detailed than that, such as car ads with women, because those wouldn't even be in your universe of text. We don't care about the articles, the ads for things like cologne or fast food restaurants, or the car ads without women. Similarly, if we're interested in something about the leads used in newspaper articles, we don't care about the whole article, only the first paragraph. That is our unit of analysis. Here are some examples. Look at these and see if you can determine the unit of analysis. If you answered political cartoons, television commercials, video games, and mainstream cable news outlets, you're correct. Remember, we have to consider our universe of text. For example, for the first one, European magazines, magazines from any year besides 2012, or comic strips are not in our universe of text, so we don't even need to consider these, so naturally, we would not analyze any unit. Okay, so now we've determined what it is we want to study, and we've gotten all the messages we want to study. It's time to start preparing our categories, our instruments for analyzing the data, and our coders. The first thing you need to do is develop your coding sheet. This is like the questionnaire you'd use in a survey. You'll use this to measure each unit of analysis. Each item needs to be related to your research questions and/or hypothesis. Just as in a survey, you aren't going to ask questions that are not related to your study. If you do, you're just taking up time that's not related to your research. Also remember that your data is at the categorical level. These need to be mutually exclusive, meaning they can only appear in one place or another. So you would define objectified as in, is the woman objectified in the car ad or not? Or you would define what is meant by invoke God as in, is God invoked or not? Your data also needs to be exhaustive. Say for example you're trying to determine if news outlets utilize social media on their websites. To do this, you make a list of social media outlets to see if they show up on the website, but you only include Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Well, what about YouTube, Pinterest, LinkedIn, Periscope, and all the others? You're going to have another category called Other, and that is really going to be full. You don't want that. That shows that you haven't done a lot of in-depth preparation for your study and really makes your study look weak. Here's an example of a coding sheet. You'll have one of these for each unit of analysis, and when you are finished coding all the units of analysis, this is what you'll use to input your data. Now, based upon your coding sheet, you'll create your code book. Your code book is critical. This is how you define each item in the coding sheet. It is designed so your co-coder or coders can code the data using the same definition you are. I, as the lead researcher, may define a weather photograph as one that is used to depict a weather phenomenon such as a hurricane, a tornado, or a flood. A lovely photograph of sunset might be nice, but that is not meant to depict the weather based upon my operationalized definition. If I don't explain this in my codebook, though, I run the risk of my fellow coder or coders coding it incorrectly. This is a good example of a codebook. The example on the left is the codebook, and on the right you see the corresponding code sheet. See how they work together? And now it's time to train your co-coders. You must have at least one other coder for a content analysis. Why? Because if you're coding on your own, you are more apt to skew your results. There are almost always going to be thoughts that come to you after you begin. For example, my research question might be, how do sports talk radio shows depict the starting quarterback following a loss? I'm going to listen to sports talk radio shows that cover teams in the AFC West the day after an AFC West loses a game. I decide I'm going to listen to the commentators and listen for blame being cast, for excuses being made, for praise for their play, or if the quarterback is even mentioned. But I don't take into account what if they get a caller. Should I code for what the caller says? What if that caller makes a compelling argument and sways one of the hosts? If I'm coding by myself, I may decide, yeah, I probably should take that into account. But that is not how I set up the study. If I have a co-coder or co-coders, that is less likely to happen. Remember, with content analysis, you're going to be doing a thing called intercoder reliability. That is really going to strengthen your study, but you're going to have to make sure you're on the same page coding in order for you to have that reliability. So, in Encoder Training, what I need to do is go over the coding sheet and the codebook. We need to discuss the definitions and see if any questions exist. Maybe my co-coder brings up the idea, what about callers? And we decide yes or no, we're going to include that. And we need to see if perhaps definitions need to be expanded even further. Next, we need to take a sample from our universe of text that is not intended to be a part of our final sample and independently code this sample. We'll then come back together, examine our results, run some statistical analysis, at this time finding the percent of agreement or percent of times we are in agreement on our coding, and if necessary, revise our coding sheets and definitions as needed. If necessary, and it usually is, we'll take another sample from the universe of text, independently code, come back together, and check again. Once we have an acceptable percent agreement, this should be high, like at least 95%, we're ready to begin coding. Here I'd like to offer an opinion. It is my very strong opinion that you should only have one other coder. It's been my experience that more than two coders becomes unwieldy. For whatever reason, the third person just doesn't get on board, the practice coding seems to go on, and ultimately you as the lead researcher are going to have to ask that person to leave. So remember that most of your data is going to be categorical or nominal. It's either present or not. They are either partaking in the activity or not. This means that most of your data analysis is going to include measures of central tendency, primarily mode, and percentages. You can do some analysis to determine differences. For example, I may look at radio station websites to determine if they are using multimedia. I can do a comparison of stations in small, medium, and large markets. My data can be ordinal. I may want to determine where in a newspaper they first report on a story about education, on the first, second, or third page. It could also be interval or ratio, though these are less likely. So, there's an introduction to content analysis. Again, these are time-consuming and challenging, as all research should be, but they can also be very fun. And remember, no IRB.